I want to welcome you to another video drasha. This week's Torah portion, Vaetchanan, which contains several very famous passages, including the Shema, and also including the Decalogue, the so-called Ten Commandments. Now, last week when I introduced the book of Deuteronomy, I said that Deuteronomy means second law, and that name is really based on a Hebrew name for the book, which is Mishnah Torah, which also means second law. And the reason why this book is called Mishnah Torah, or Deuteronomy, is because in it are repeated many of the narratives and laws that we already encountered in the earlier books of the Torah, particularly in the books of Exodus and Numbers. And a very good example of this is the fact that the Decalogue, which we had back in the book of Exodus, of course, which is where it belonged when we left Egypt and came to Mount Sinai, and there received the Torah. But here, Moses is repeating the story of what happened at Mount Sinai, and he repeats the Decalogue. But as I said last week, the fact that Deuteronomy repeats many things doesn't mean that it simply quotes them verbatim. As a matter of fact, it generally restates things in ways that give us a different perspective. And in some cases, there are discrepancies between the two versions which require explanation. And indeed, many commentators have provided explanations for these discrepancies. And so today I wanted to just give an example of this from the Decalogue. So back in Exodus, where we first have the Decalogue, the commandment regarding the Sabbath begins with the word Zachor, remember. Zachor et Yom HaShabbat, remember the Sabbath day. Whereas here in Deuteronomy, it begins with the word Shamor, observe the Sabbath. Shamor et Yom HaShabbat. Now, we actually have this, we'll call it discrepancy, mentioned in a song which is familiar to us, the song that we sing on Friday nights at the beginning of Shabbat, Lecha Dodi, where one of the verses in Lecha Dodi says, Shamor v'zachor bedibor echad, hishmianu el hamiuchad. That's it. Shamor and Zachor, observe and remember, God made us here in one statement. So that the idea is that God only stated the Decalogue once, but somehow we heard both of these things. We heard Shamor and we heard Zachor. Now, even more than simply this difference of one word, the fact is that the commandment to observe the Sabbath, in Exodus, there's a different rationale that is given. The fact is the commandment begins by saying 6 days you shall work, and the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. You shall do no work, you, your son, your daughter, your male and female slave, your cattle as well. But then in Exodus, the explanation is given that it is because God created the world in 6 days and he rested on the seventh day. And therefore he blessed and hallowed the seventh day. So that the rationale for the Sabbath given back in Exodus was the creation of the world, which took place in 6 days, and God rested on the seventh. But here in Deuteronomy, we have the following. I'm going to read for you the commandment. It says, observe the Sabbath day and keep it holy, as the Lord your God has commanded you. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath of the Lord your God. You shall not do any work, you, your son, or your daughter, your male or female slave, your ox or your ass, or any of your cattle, or the stranger in your settlements. Now, up until that point, the wording in both places is relatively similar, but the version in Deuteronomy now diverges from that in Exodus, and it says, so that your male and female slave may rest as you do. Remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God freed you from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore the Lord your God has commanded you to observe the Sabbath day. So that the rationale here in Deuteronomy is not the creation of the universe or the creation of the world in 6 days, but rather the fact that we were slaves in Egypt, therefore we need to give our slaves a day off once a week on the Sabbath. Now, again, both of these ideas are incorporated into something that is familiar to us, and that is the Kiddush that we say on Friday nights, where we say that the Sabbath is a zikaron lema'aseh bereshit, a memorial to the creation, and it is also a zecher litziat Mitzrayim, a remembrance of the Exodus from Egypt. So we see that both of these ideas that come from the two different versions of the Decalogue are to be found in the Kiddush for Sabbath that we say on Friday nights. I also want to say that this Sabbath is a special Sabbath. It is called Shabbat Nachamu, and that name comes from the Haftarah portion, which is from the prophet Isaiah, and begins with the words, Nachamu, Nachamu, be comforted, O Zion. Now, as I am recording this Drasha, it is Thursday, and it is Tisha B'Av. Tisha B'Av is, of course, the day of mourning. It is the saddest day of the Jewish year. It is the low point of the Jewish calendar. It is the day on which we literally sit on the floor and mourn the destruction of both temples. And we also mourn almost every other catastrophe in Jewish history which somehow is linked to this date of the 9th day of Av, Tisha B'Av. And so this is the lowest point of the calendar, the saddest day of the year. It is a day of mourning. It is a day on which we fast for 25 hours. And we observe other mourning practices as well. But it is also a day, and I think this is a very important idea. You know, it is a day that contains within itself the idea of redemption. The fact of the matter is that this day on which we commemorate all of these destructions and on which we mourn, it is a day that has the potential to be a holiday, a yontiv. And I think that we see this idea, for instance, hinted at in the fact that we don't put on tefillin on Tisha B'Av morning. We do put tefillin on in the afternoon, but not in the morning. And although there are various explanations given for this, to me, I've always found the most meaningful explanation to be the fact that, we don't put on tefillin on holidays. And I think that this is hinting to the idea that someday Tisha B'Av is going to be a yontiv. It's going to be a holiday. We also see this idea that Tisha B'Av contains within itself the potential for redemption in the fact that the tradition does say in some places that the Messiah will be born on Tisha B'Av. I mean, what clearer symbol could there be that redemption is potential in this day? What greater symbol could there be except for the fact that the Messiah will be born on this day? I think we also see this idea that in destruction we still maintain our hope for redemption in a story that is told of Rabbi Akiva. There's a story told in the Talmud that Rabbi Akiva and his colleagues were walking by the ruins of the temple, not that long after the destruction. And Rabbi Akiva's colleagues were crying when they saw that there were jackals, there were wild animals climbing over the ruins of the temple, of the holy Beit HaMikdash, the holy temple of God. And Rabbi Akiva started to laugh. And his colleagues said to him, "Rabbi, how can you laugh when you see this destruction?" And Rabbi Akiva said, "Because this proves to me that just as the prophecies that said that the Jewish people would be punished for their sins, just as those prophecies came true, so will the prophecies of our redemption also come true." And so in the destruction of the temple, Rabbi Akiva was able to see this potential for the future redemption. And again, it's the idea that we should never give up hope. In Judaism, there is no despair. There is no hopelessness. And I think we also see the potential in Tisha B'Av in the fact that from this low point of the Jewish calendar, we are eventually going to get to Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, the day on which our sins are forgiven. And by the way, it's a very interesting thing that in English, the word atonement is really the word at one meant. The idea is that that Yom Kippur is the day on which we become one, the day on which we are reconciled with God. And that process of that we're going to get to begins this Shabbat, Shabbat Nachamu, the Shabbat of be comforted, O Zion. The idea that we start reading the 7 Haftarah portions of consolation on this Shabbos. These are the Haftarah portions that remind us that despite what looks very dark right now, God never forgets the Jewish people, that ultimately redemption is coming, and that there is yet a glorious future ahead of us. And so each of these 7 Haftarah portions that we begin reading on this Shabbos are a prediction of that redemption which will come in the future. And of course, Yom Kippur being the day of forgiveness, the day of atonement, it is the day on which we ultimately have this reconciliation with God. And then even beyond Yom Kippur, we have yet Sukkot and the holiday of Simchat Torah, which literally means the rejoicing in the Torah, the day on which we dance around with the Torah. It's very hard to imagine that today on Tisha B'Av, as we're sitting on the floor and mourning and fasting and reading the book of Lamentations. But ultimately, in just a few short weeks, sooner than you can imagine, we will be dancing with the Torahs on Simchat Torah. And so that is really the important idea that we should see, that in Tisha B'Av, in Tisha B'Av, there is already this hope for, this potential for forgiveness, for atonement, and ultimately for redemption. That in Judaism, we never give up hope. We never despair. Good Shabbos.